today is case 35, Manjushri's Threes and Threes. Engo's introduction. In distinguishing dragon from snake, jewel from stone, black from white, irresolute from decisive, if one does not have the clear eye of the mind and the amulet under the arm, one invites instant failure. Just at this moment, if one's vision and hearing are clear, and color and sound are truly cognized, tell me, is he black or white, crooked or straight? The subtle difference, how could you discern it? Main subject. Manjushri asked Muchaku, where have you recently come from? Muchaku said, from the south. How is Southern Buddhism faring? Asked Manjushri. The monks of the latter days of the law observe the Buddha's precepts a little. Manjushri asked, are there many or few? And Muchaku said, here about 300, there about 500. Then Muchaku asked Manjushri, how does Buddhism fare in your part of the world? Manjushri said, the worldly and the holy are living together. Dragons and snakes are mingled. And are there many or few? Asked Manjushri. Manjushri responded, the former threes and threes, the latter threes and threes. Secho's verse, the thousand hills, peak upon peak, deep blue. Who can converse with Manjushri? How I laugh at many or few. How I admire the former threes and threes, the latter threes and threes. So for context, the notes here are pretty important, and I'm just going to quote them directly. Muchaku lived between 821 and 900 in China. His personal name was Bunki. Muchaku, mu is our mu, no, not, nothing. Chaku, attachment. No attachment was his Dharma name and an honorific name given to him in his latter years by the emperor, so somebody pretty well known. As a youth, Muchaku traveled all over the country visiting Zen teachers. And the story of the present case seems to have been an incident occurring during one of his journeys. He studied under Kyozan and eventually succeeded him. It is related that Muchaku made a pilgrimage to Mount Godai, a holy mountain long dedicated to Manjushri. It was evening when he arrived, and he found a temple at the foot of the mountain and stayed there overnight. The master priest of the temple met him, and the conversation related here took place. The next morning, when Muchaku was leaving, he was accompanied to the gate of the temple by a boy who had been deputied by the master priest to see Muchaku off. Muchaku asked the boy who was the master and what was the name of the temple. The boy, without saying anything, pointed to the mountain. Muchaku looked up and saw the mountain above him, colored in beautiful deep blue. When he looked back, he found that the temple, the boy, and everything had disappeared. In their place, he saw a lonely valley. Muchaku realized that the master priest had been Manjushri himself, who had appeared for the sake of his conversation or devotee. So the whole case turns out to be a dream. I don't know if you've ever dreamed while doing Zazen, but I have oftentimes, and I'm sure everyone else has. And that's entirely normal because in Zazen, we are slowly dropping the barriers between self and other, but also between what we call conscious and unconscious, between day reality and night reality. And we're trying to sit in this place that transcends self and other, day reality and night reality, and even transcends life and death, right? We want to sit in this translucent kind of place where we're breathing very, very slowly and gently, almost at the level of being in a coma, very slow, gentle breaths. And we are somehow aware of our kind of daydream material at the same time as being awakened in this room. We don't want to fall completely into a dream and fall asleep. On the other hand, we are trying to sit in this translucent kind of place between life and death, between self and other, between day reality and dream reality. Ideally, our practice over years helps us gently fall into this kind of transcendent, translucent place. And this is ripe then for insights, or in this case, for Muchaku to have this dream. While I was sitting in morning Zazen this morning, during the very first sit, of course, I was thinking about Gregory, who just passed on Friday. And I was thinking about all of the people who died in Lahaina. And I'm very familiar with the streets of Lahaina. I've been going there for probably 50 years. And I know all the shops, and I know the movie theater, and the church, and the jail, and the old courthouse, and the ice cream parlors, and the restaurants, and the banyan tree, and the APC stores. And I just know that street like it's the back of my hand, and it's all gone. So that street, even though it's all gone, is very alive in my mind. And the terror that must have happened on that street as the flames were being blown by 80-mile-an-hour trade winds, taking the grasses and blowing it into the buildings that were on fire, into the buildings, and them catching like quick tinder, where more than 90 people have lost their lives. Probably well over 100. Just the terror that must have been going on at the same time. We sit with such things, don't we, when this kind of information comes to us through the news, and then we do Zazen. How can we not sit with such things? Or Gregory's passing. But besides this material, which was just bubbling around during morning Zazen, including pain, because I was doing full lotus right now full lotus, even though usually that's as smooth as a knife through warm butter because of my hip injury. Trying to do full lotus these days is a little like being in the middle of Rohatsu. And I did 2 full lotus sits this morning. So I watched the pain train. You know how that is? We all face pain when we're doing Zazen if we sit long enough. And there are multiple cars in that pain train. There's the stabbing pain, the aching pain, the sciatic pain, the lower back pain, the knee pain, the hip pain. You know, we all know these pains. So I was watching that too. This is just what's going on in my head during one sit of Zazen. Well, there was another image that popped up, which was Myoshin, bright, heart mind, Virginia Dunthorne. And I was wondering, why was she sitting at a table there in my Zazen this morning? And so I thought, oh, I know why. And during breakfast, I went up and listened to the first 5 or 10 minutes of her Follower of the Way talk that she gave here, right down at the other end of this hall, in 2015. And during that Follower of the Way Dharma talk, she talked about being in Bali with some friends on a kind of tour where they were visiting different sacred sites. And she talked about how, on the island there was a blend of Buddhism and Hinduism and indigenous animistic religions, and they were all mixed up and all blended, and you couldn't really tell one from the other. And they had taken a trip up into the highlands and had a little boat trip around a lake, a very high lake in Bali. And they came to a Buddhist temple, and they all got out and walked around, completely abandoned. And at one point, she related to all of us that she saw some monks coming. It was a surprise to her because it was an abandoned temple, but here were some monks coming to the temple. And she thought, well, there must be some other temple somewhere, and they're coming to visit this historic site as I am. And there were niches in the wall that at one time had standing bodhisattvas, but they had disintegrated or were not there. But it was interesting that when the monks came, that they jumped up into these niches and became live statues. And she thought, well, that's amazing and how delightful. And she went to turn and tell her friends, oh, isn't this great that these monks came by and jumped into these niches and became live statues, maybe just for us. But her friends weren't there when she turned around. So she went looking for them to tell them about this. But then, as she found her friends, she thought, I'm not going to tell them, because she thought to herself, this must be a dream, because no one could jump up into those niches the way that the monks had. They'd have to be, she said, even Berevkov couldn't have made that kind of jump. So I'm not going to tell my friends about this, because clearly they would think I was going nuts. There were a lot of strange things that happened in Bali, and I'll just keep this to myself. Well, one day, she came across an advertisement. She was in part of the Episcopal Church at St. Mark's Cathedral, and she saw an advertisement that somebody was giving a talk. A couple of people were giving a talk on, I think it was how to do discernment from a Christian perspective and a Buddhist perspective. And the person giving it on the Buddhist perspective, she said in the talk, well, guess who it was? It was Genjo who was giving this talk. And when I went to the talk and I met Genjo, I realized it was Genjo who had jumped up to the high niche. I had found the monk who had done this, and I thought, well, that's quite some omen. I better go check this out. So she came to a Zazenkai, and her first Zazenkai, she said, oh my God, that was not for me. I couldn't understand what was going on. It was way too painful. And she talked about pain for a while, and then she said, but Genjo kept sending the newsletter. And I kept reading more and more, and I thought, I got to go back to this. And she eventually started sitting with us when she was around 70, quite consistently, when we had the old Chobo-Ji house on 20th near Madison. That's when she started to sit with us, just as Teisho did. And he must have come around the same time. Then, of course, she also sat with us here and did sesshin and rohatsus, and oh my goodness, she just, in her late 70s, made this happen and died a few years ago. But she appeared in my Zazen this morning, I think for good reason. Her story about Genjo jumping up in the niche, and that somehow being of some importance to her, that it ended up becoming a big part of her life, is somehow very related, I think, to this story and this koan. How can it not be very, very similar? Very similar. Well, let's delve into this dream that Muchaku had when visiting Mount Godai, and he dreams a whole temple and being with the chief monk, who he later realizes was all a dream and was actually Manjushri, who in Manjushri mythology has a habit of appearing in this way for pilgrims, that Manjushri takes this form of a temple priest to give instruction in people's dreams. Manjushri, of course, is the mythological teacher of all Buddhas, not just the historical Buddha. And the statue of Manjushri is on my left, looking at the Buddha on the main altar. So Manjushri asked Muchaku, where have you come from? Now this is already a koan, because you can answer from the relative, nothing wrong with that, or you can answer from the absolute, or you can answer from the transcendent. And in the dream, this is interesting, in the dream, Muchaku answers entirely from the relative, I've come from the south. Well, how is Buddhism faring in the south? Asks Manjushri. And Muchaku says, the monks of the latter days of the law observe the Buddha's precepts a little. Now this is full of meaning. I have to go back to the notes. The 500 years after the death of Shakyamuni Buddha are called the age of the genuine law, where people actually followed the precepts. The next 1,000 years are called the age of pseudo-genuine law. And the following 10,000 years are called the latter days of the law, where we are losing sight of the precepts. And in a real way, if you look at Zen in America, I think in Japan and in America, the Zen tradition in many ways lost sight of the precepts. We've kind of brought them back. It's not that we lost sight of them entirely, but the precepts as a guide, not as a law, but as a guide for, are we drawing in the lines or not in terms of our day-to-day interactions with the world. They're a great map. And a lot of, I think, Zen tilted a little too far the pendulum into, I don't need a map. I just follow my heart mind, period. And that can get you in trouble because we so easily fool ourselves. We're so expert at fooling ourselves. So the precepts are a check on fooling ourselves, and we should keep them in mind and teach them in Zen, because indeed we're all about following our heartline, but we need a check because we fool ourselves so easily. But I digress. And how many are there? Well, here there are about 300 and there are about 500. Again, Muchaku is in his dream. This is interesting. It's in his dream. It's speaking entirely from the relative, which as a Zen master himself, he would know better. But he's also in the dream, got Manjushri up there, so not to worry. So in the dream, Manjushri takes the absolute side of things. The character in the dream of Muchaku takes the relative sides of things, and we'll hear the balance from Manjushri, because Muchaku asks, how is it where you are? And Manjushri says, it's a beautiful line, the worldly and the holy are living together. Dragons and snakes are mingled. Now this line, the worldly and the holy are living together, dragons and snakes are mingled, is the core of this koan. This koan has many parts, but the core of it is this line. How is this understood? What does this mean? The worldly and the holy are living together. Dragons and snakes are mingled. Well, one hint here that's just real obvious is that dragons are mythological creatures. Snakes are real creatures. And Manjushri says that in his realm, they're mixed together. They're mixed together. So if you come to this koan and you're working with me, keep that in mind. The worldly and holy are living together. I would add that the dead and alive are working together. As I said in my opening remarks, even though Gregory has now dropped his body, we are still living together, even though Myoshin dropped her body some years ago. Clearly, as she appeared in my dream state this morning, we are living together and intermingled. And then from the absolute or the real perspective, that's how it really is. From the relative perspective, Gregory's dead, and the ocean is dead, and I just had a dream. But from the real perspective, the ocean this morning is very alive. Gregory is very alive. And in this case, Manjushri and Muchaku are very alive and intermingling with us right now. Here's the next part of the koan. Are there many or few? Asked Muchaku about the realm of the real of Manjushri. And Manjushri, who's represented in Muchaku's dream as the absolute, says, the former's threes and threes, the latter threes and threes. Now, when I first began studying this koan, I'm going, I'm never going to get this. What the hell does that mean? This is a bunch of Chinese gobbledygook. Fortunately, there are notes. I'm going to read this note because anybody else could read the note too. The answer of Montessori's is very much admired, especially the words threes and threes. It answers the question in terms of numbers, but without specifying a particular number. Imagine those people passing in endless succession, in twos and threes, through eons of time. Now, if you gave me this answer from the book, I would say that's exactly right, shorten it. This note gives the answer to that part of the koan, and I won't elaborate further because it really just needs to be shortened. And I won't give you the shortened version because I would like you to find it. This all takes place inside of Muchaku's dream. He probably does some zazen, has a dream. This is my head now. He wakes up the next morning and figures this all out in his head. And it's such an insightful dream that he passes it on, and we're hearing it today.
Shujo Mugen